Good afternoon. We're here today with Kristine Huskey from the University of Texas at Austin. She's had much experience in human rights. Among other things, she defended detainees in Guantanamo Bay. So we're here today to ask her a few questions about her work and her perspective on things. So thanks for being with us, Kristine.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you again.
So our first question has to do with human rights and national security. Obviously, in countries where there are security issues, talking about human rights is not so popular. There can be a perceived tension that guaranteeing human rights leads to less security. Given your experience as a lawyer for detainees in Guantanamo, what advice would you have for human rights defenders in countries where there is this perceived tension who are trying to change public opinion?
That's really an excellent question, because in the United States, as you rightly point out, there is, it's always talked about as if you had less protection of human rights and less civil rights, you would have more security. And I thought what was interesting when Obama had his inaugural speech, he gave his speech, he said, we reject as false the choice between security and liberty and freedoms, basically, human rights. So he was trying to say, you can have both. And I think that's sort of my initial response, is to say, is that you shouldn't, when you talk about human rights, you really need to sort of make it clear that it's not a sort of a balancing test. Whereas, if you have less security, you get more human rights, or if you have, more human rights, you have less security, is to sort of talk about it in a way that doesn't pit them against each other, that says, keeping with our ideals of a democracy, of a civilized country, we need to have both, and that you can have security and protect, the way it sort of is how you speak about it. Say, we can have security and protect our fundamental values, which is sort of code for human rights. But instead of saying protect our human rights, which I think causes people, like you said, to go, oh, we can't have those. But if you say we want to protect our fundamental values, people say, of course we want to protect our fundamental values. We don't want to stray from those values. But what we're talking about when we say fundamental values are the core protections of human rights, the due process and protections against arbitrary deprivation of liberty and things like that. So it's kind of how you phrase it, just in the language, I think, is the starting point.
And in terms of tactical advice, like let's say you have a country like Colombia where the current administration supposedly has been very successful in countering terrorism, and supposedly there's more security than there has been in a long time. And you also have this administration that has, some level of public support that is quite high, one of the highest in Latin America. It's been very difficult, probably, for the human rights defenders to even get access to media outlets. How would you suggest that they proceed? How would they try to even begin to work public opinion?
I think that's sort of, reminds me of some of my experience in the United States in representing Guantanamo detainees. I think, again, I sort of go back to a lot of it sort of in the language that you use, when you sort of present yourself as, I'm advocating for human rights for all. It can be very threatening to people who feel like they're secure, and they say, oh, we're secure now, so we don't need human rights. And it's sort of in the way that you portray what values you're protecting, and so you have to, you have to make it come back to what is it that makes, our society or the society in Colombia so great. It's the fact that we have the freedom to do certain things and the fact that we feel secure. So it's sort of connecting those two. I think with the with the public opinion and the media, it is sort of all about the language, and it's about making sure that you don't make the public feel like they're threatened or that you will take away the security. that they must choose between civil rights or human rights and security. And in the Guantanamo litigation that I've done, there was always, yes, we had to fight against the government and we had to convince the courts, but there was the bigger task of convincing the public of the need for protecting human rights. And I think what has worked is lawyers have taken specific examples of how the lives of humans can be just destroyed when you take away their human rights. And so focused on very specific examples. So again, using the Guantanamo detentions, lawyers who represented clients who, turns out they were completely innocent and they'd been at Guantanamo for 4 or 5 years and they never had the opportunity to go into a court and present evidence. And to say, this guy has been detained for 5 years and meanwhile he's completely innocent. To use very specific examples of people who got detained wrongly, or transfer that to Colombia and other, examples of where people were hurt, where their families were hurt, where children were hurt, because human rights protections were ignored in the name of national security, right? Because we think, let's pick up this guy, he's a threat to national security, and let's just detain him, let's never release him. And then to show how that hurt real people, his family, his children, and that in the end, if he had just had a process that was fair, the right and the truth could have come out. The truth would have come out.
And another question that we have is, in defending Guantanamo clients, obviously you had many restrictions to them imposed by the U.S. government, perhaps logistical difficulties. How were you able to maintain the contact with your clients and also keep their spirits up?
Yeah, that was, you're absolutely right. The logistical restrictions that the government put on, one, because they're on an island, on a, in a maximum security prison, on a military base, and there's just a whole, number of hoops you had to sort of jump through just to even see your client. And we were not allowed to just call them, sort of arbitrarily, or say, oh, sir, hey, I'd like to talk to my client next week, just to talk to him, to keep up the communication and the relationship. No, you weren't allowed to do that. So there was a lot of difficulties in that regard. And when I first started going down there, just even getting their trust, because they'd been detained without lawyers, and they had no idea who I was, and sort of taking the time really to listen to them and not to all of a sudden come in with your, lawyers love to ask questions, right? So, you have to restrain yourself and have patience and just let them do the talking, and always make them, first, and that you may have all these questions and you may want to ask them, sort of deposition-like style, but you really have to let the client do the talking because they're going through this. They're in prison. They're the ones who are in prison, and they could have had something terrible happen to them a week ago, and they can't tell anybody about it. So when you go visit them, you have to let them do the talking. I think that's really, key. And then writing letters, because I work in a clinic and I have students, that's one of their jobs, is we have to write letters to the client, as often as possible. So let him know that we are always there on his side, working on his behalf, because, so much time can go by and the client in a prison has no contact with the outside world, and that can be really devastating and cause them to lose hope. And I've had clients who've lost hope, and then you just have to try to go in there and build it back up again with a lot of optimistic views about their future.
Well, thank you very much, Kristine. Those are very interesting responses, and we hope to speak with you again very soon.
Thank you for having me, and again, it's really nice seeing you again.